Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Direct, O Lord, all our actions by thy holy inspirations, and carry them on by thy gracious assistance, so that every prayer and work of ours may begin from thee and by thee, be happily through Christ our Lord. Amen. Our Lady of Divine Grace, pray for us. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay, so the title of this conference is The Principle of Evidence. Well, it's just something I've just been observing quite a bit. Anybody who observes our culture is starting to notice the breakdown of this principle. Like any first principle, St. Thomas says, actually it's Aristotle, and St. Thomas says it is. Aristotle says that in relationship to first principles, as long as a person has use of reason, once you formulate the principle, they can immediately grasp the truth of it. The problem is that people have been acting so consistently against this principle of evidence, as we'll see as we go along, that it's one of the indicators that our culture, by and large, is mentally ill at this point. I mean, I think most people are they're completely out of it. So, and basically, the way we see it is people simply just ignore facts today. I love that line from President Biden. He said, you might have the facts, but we have the truth, right? Which indicates in his mind, what is true is completely divorced from the evidence. It's completely divorced from reality, okay? One of the signs of the principle of evidence, we'll formulate what it is and go into it in detail, actually. There's a variety of different variants, and there's subparts to them. But one of them is anybody who has any semblance of the use of reason knows that this is a legitimate piece of evidence. They're dismissing it or taking it out on technicalities or whatever just to get the cases dismissed. So evidence has no bearing as far as they're concerned. Another example of violation, we're going to talk about this a couple of times during this conference, is evolution. One of the real problems with the theory of evolution is that it doesn't take into consideration all of the evidence. So the fact, for example, that in Texas, that there is a set of dinosaur tracks, I think they're even Tyrannosaurus rex or something like that, tracks, and on the inside of those tracks is a set of human footprints tracking the animal, okay, is an indicate, and yet they act like that human beings came drastically different time than the dinosaurs did, right? And they still maintain that it was hundreds of millions of years, And so they never pay any attention to the evidence. Or in Pennsylvania, in the coal mines, there's a couple of the coal mines that actually have a piece of timber that's going through, according to their estimates, hundreds of millions of years of strata. Well, you can't have, in stratification, you can't have something that's biodegradable that's going to last for 100 million years in order for it to become encased in the manner that they said it is. So you have this piece of evidence that flies completely in the face of evolution. Or another one is the second law of thermodynamics is one of them, but then also genetic entropy, the fact that genetically we are degrading, not improving, which is what evolution would have to hold, that we're actually degrading over the course of time, was the death knell, but everyone's acting like it doesn't exist, and they keep promoting it. I did a conference once where I talked about how the head of the Parisian Freemasonic Lodge, when he first heard the theory of evolution, admitted it was totally bogus, but he said, we're going to use it anyway to promote our ends. So they're not interested in the truth. Then, of course, you have the mainstream news media. Every time you turn around, they're just completely ignoring the reality of something, or they'll even show it to you. Or they've got we've talked about this before, or you got the guy standing there. It's mostly peaceful protests while the building's burning in the background, right? And so they're even trying to get people to ignore the evidence. Government officials and big pharma ignored the evidence of the vaccines causing certain health issues. They just ignored it. They continue to ignore it. They act like it doesn't exist, etc. These are just a few examples of one of the things that we've seen where the evidence doesn't have any bearing on people's thinking anymore, which basically means they're disconnected from reality. So what is the principle of evidence? Well, it has different forms, and so we're going to formulate it. I'll give you the formulation of it that has been given by the philosophers, and then we can talk about the individual aspects of it. So the first, or the primary form in which it takes is this. The objective evidence of being is the criterion of the truth of assent and the motive for certain assent or the certitude of assent. Okay, we're going to unpack that. So the objective evidence, what does that mean? Evidence is something that shows itself, it manifests itself, because it literally comes from ex videre, which means out of what is seen. So it's something that literally presents itself, it's in reality, it shows itself, and you can actually look at it and see it, right? So, and it's objective. It's not my subjective perception on that thing. It's how the thing shows itself in reality constitutes what is the objective criteria of this thing. So it's the objective criteria of being. It's not my thought. It's being. It's things that actually exist. How they exist and how they manifest themselves to us is the criteria for truth. Now, if you remember, definition of truth is, do the Latin, adequatio intellectus ad rem. Sometimes it's et re, but I want to do this one specifically. So it's the adequation, which basically means that what's in my mind conforms to what's in reality. And so the intellect conforms, ad rem means to the thing. So I know the truth when my mind conforms to the reality of the thing as it is in reality. Not how I feel, not my perceptions, but how the thing actually is. Okay. So it's the objective evidence of being, which is basically means the thing. But they're talking about thing insofar as it shows itself. So when we're talking about the principle of evidence, we're talking about what basically gives my intellect the ability to think that what I believe about this thing is true is the fact that this thing which I see and manifests itself to me, it's that fact that it shows itself to me is the criterion for me giving assent to the fact that it's actually true. This is really key because this is the fundamental problem. The evidence is that is the showing itself is the fundamental problem with the theory of dark matter. It can't be seen, measured, touched, it can't even be inferred, etc. It's literally something that they had to make up out of thin air in order to account for certain anomalies in astrophysics in relationship to, I think if I'm not mistaken, I'm open to correction on this, primarily in relationship to the theory of relativity. So as you apply relativity in certain circumstances, then the fact that the universe is expanding and increasing in that expansion rate according to their measurements, which, by the way, is itself open to debate. They say, well, the only thing there has to be some other kind of matter that is causing this acceleration. There's no evidence for this whatsoever. You have certain anomalies, but that could be a problem with your calculations. It could be other things. It could be you're not interpreting the data properly. It could be you're not looking at the thing properly. There could be 100 different explanations for that. But literally, they have yet to be able to come up with, well, there it is. There's dark matter, because there isn't any. So if it doesn't show itself, then it's not the criterion for the truth of assent. Now, this becomes really important, too, in the sense that this truth of assent, this is actually one of the real problems that you actually have. We'll talk about this a little bit later. It's the problem with people saying, well, whenever you go to the new Mass, you're stepping on the Eucharist. Okay, we have a problem here. Because most people don't even understand the history of the tradition regarding that. There are times, I admit, that it's actually true, but most of the time, it's actually not. Not that I'm a big fan of communion in the hand. Everybody knows I'm not. But just that people have to look at the evidence. If I can't see it, it ain't there. Right? Okay, so this is something which is important for us in relationship, at least in relationship to the Eucharist. So the point being is it's the thing in reality that determines the criterion for truth, that I give assent to this thing is, it's that thing in reality determines what I'm supposed to think about it. Okay, and the motive for certitude or certainty of assent. What does that mean? Okay, first of all, it not only does the fact that it shows itself, it's the thing that is the fact that the thing is actually there. And not only the fact that what we know about the thing, but the second thing is the degree of certitude that I have about it. What does this mean? It means that human faculties have certain limitations. And how do we know that? First of all, we can't see the infrared. So what do? In order to be able to see infrared signatures, we have an electronic device that has material in it that can sense the heat patterns, etc. And then what it does is it through that electronic thing, those heat signatures affect the sensor, and then from that it's amplified and it's modified and brought within the range of our visual perception. That's how those things actually function. Same with ultraviolet and the like. Okay, so that's actually how we actually are able to see that we know that there's infrared for sure. I mean, we can obviously do other things to infer it, etc. The point being is that though the degree of certitude, because our faculties are limited, it means there are certain things that we simply don't have the certitude about, except in varying degrees. Now, there's some things that we are absolutely certain about. So, for example, the fact that this table, which is sitting in front of me, is there and exists, we have what St. Thomas calls physical certitude. This is absolute physical. We have absolute physical certitude that this thing exists, right? Because it's there, I can touch it, taste it, feel it, etc. Okay. But then there's other things that there's certain kinds of evidence, and then we have to extrapolate certain things, or that the evidence just doesn't give us, there might be parts of the evidence that are there, but not the totality of the evidence in order to fully understand the thing. And as a result of that, then, by that I mean in the sense of within our range of our faculties. This is important because it means, and this is something that's very key, you used to hear some of the philosophers talk about nature's secrets. Nature has no secrets whatsoever. Zero. None. What you see is what you get. The fact that it's hard for us to grasp certain things is based on the limitations of our faculties. And so it takes a certain amount of time for us to kind of hone in on certain aspects of physical things in order to understand them or to actually come to understand their nature. It doesn't mean that it's hiding the nature. It just means that it's because of the limitations of our faculties, we have a hard time seeing it. That being the case, this thing is still the criteria for the certitude. How well our faculties are able to conform and grasp the nature of the thing determines our degree of certitude. Okay, what does that mean? It basically means that there are certain things we just don't know for certain. And the more we study them and the more we're able to hone in on certain things and hone in our judgment of our knowledge of our perceptions and our actual sensory experiences of things, over the course of time we start to figure the thing out. But it takes time, but it's the thing that is the criteria for truth, not my perception and not my lack of precision and judgment. Rather, and this is what evidence does, if a person's going to follow evidence the way we're supposed to follow it, it's going to slowly over the course of time, if you're always willing to follow the truth regardless of personal cost, and you're willing to follow the evidence regardless of where it leads, then eventually your judgment is going to become more and more precise in relationship to the thing, and your certitude about the thing will increase. Now, there are certain things because of human limitations. It doesn't matter what we do on a material side to bring it within the confines of our limitations of our faculties. We're just never going to fully understand these things. We're just never going to get it. There's certain natural mysteries, and it's not because the thing isn't manifesting itself. It's because of the limitation of our faculties. But this is important because the criteria for the truth is the objective evidence of being. The being shows itself, it's just that we can't necessarily see it, right? There's ultraviolet and infrared signatures are all over the place. That's like it's moving around. We just don't see it. It doesn't mean it's not there. It's just that we don't see it. But if we do certain things, we can start to infer it, and then we can bring it within the confines of our bring it within the limitations of our faculties by using certain devices, etc. And then we can gain some more and more certitude about how it works. This is one of the reasons for it, and there are certain, like for example, what light is somewhat of a mystery. Some consider it has mass, and then in other ways it acts like it doesn't have mass. It looks like it's in a wave, but it also acts like a particle. So there's different, we don't have full, and then part of it is even though we see light all the time, our faculties are too limited to have a perfect understanding of what we're seeing, right? We know that there's this distinction between materially the thing showing itself and formally us seeing it just by virtue of the fact that there are times when we're looking at our desk and we're trying to find our keys. We're looking right at the keys. We're looking right at them, and yet we don't recognize them, right? It's the same kind of a phenomenon, okay? This degree of certitude, the thing determines how much certitude we can have, is extraordinarily important. We see this in relationship to evolution and many scientific theories, such as string theory or dark matter, as I mentioned. They do not have sufficient evidence to conclude with any degree of certitude. And this is my concern about the empirical sciences. My concern is that we have reached a stage in our history regarding the empirical sciences where if we were serious about the principle of evidence, the scientific advancement could be astounding that we could be making. And of course, removing all agenda and all this nonsense from people who are doing the funding and all that jazz. If we just got that out and actually funded pure science and started following the objective criteria, we're at a point where we could be advancing things drastically, but we're not. We're getting we're getting stymied because of, for example, even in things like medicine and things like that, we're getting stymied because of all this agenda where they'll only fund certain kinds of research and not others. And so as a result, we don't find out that this particular thing actually works with this because they really wanted to fund this because this guy had money invested in it, etc. So this is the problem that we're actually seeing. But the criteria is that in the empirical sciences, they don't have enough evidence to conclude certain things. Contrary. So the point being is that, and this is the thing that's concerning me, is that, but then of course they conclude things are more certain than they actually are. So for example, the Big Bang is purely a theory. There's all sorts of alternative explanations for things like redshift and the like that we see in the planets, or not the planets, but in the galaxies that are moving away from us, etc. There's all sorts of explanation for redshift aside from expansion. And also, there's also certain evidence. One guy actually took all the data that NASA has, because you apparently can get access to it, plugged it into a computer about all the locations of all the different galaxies and their trajectories, and then just had the computer track it back. It didn't go back to a single point. So we've got a problem, right? The point being is that the evidence isn't there, but they act like the Big Bang and evolution is absolute, undisputable fact. We see this with climate change. All scientists believe this. Well, first of all scientists don't believe this. Second of all, it's not, in my lifetime, I have not seen a significant shift to where I could say that there was significant changes in climate. It's different, I'll admit that, but it's not it's not outside the gamut that we haven't seen within the history of this planet. So the point being is that they act like this stuff is dogma, when in point in fact, but if you look underneath that, the people who are dogmatizing that, it always goes back to the money. Somebody stands to make money either on the research or on, but we have to carbon tax people. Someone's getting money out of this thing, is what ends up happening in most cases. This started happening even in the medical profession when Rockefeller started funding medical schools to train them to teach people about pharmaceutical chemicals as opposed to natural things and he actually got them to label the natural stuff as quackery, even though some of it legitimately is, but some of it actually worked, in order so that people would actually buy the pharmaceuticals that were made from oil, so he'd make more money, right? So all his philanthropy is always to make money. Okay, so this is where they stopped following the evidence. But fortunately, in that area, we're starting to see some of that come back. But over the course of time, this lack of certitude where they just dogmatize things, and it's a bit disconcerting because they'll say, well, we know for absolute fact this is what the story is. I'm not so sure about that. 2 years later, well, that theory's wrong, and now we know this is absolute fact. Well, quit that behavior, right? Just tell us, this is our theory, this is what we're working off of, this is what we're going to try and investigate, but instead they try and make it into dogma. We don't even have certitude, as I've mentioned, about what's going on in Ukraine. I've read articles that are all over the map. I've read articles that say that the Russian military is completely destroyed. Usually that's from our government and our mainstream news media. But then you look at alternative news sites or even stuff that's coming from Ukraine and elsewhere, and they're saying that, that basically Ukraine is getting mopped up in this operation, and that that there's not that many Russians dying, whereas half the military of Ukraine has been wiped out. I've also read articles that say only 11% of the Russian military has even been committed to this thing. We don't have certitude about what's going on in there because the lying is so pervasive. That the evidence that they keep presenting to us doesn't admit of certitude. Okay. This is a key point. We do not have certitude about the end times, and this is important for traditionalists. We have certitude about certain things. For example, we know for certain that Our Lady's Immaculate Heart will triumph. We know from what she predicted that there will be an era of peace. We know that there will be 25 years of good harvest, as she mentioned in La Salette. We also know that, for example, that as she said in Akita Japan, it'll be cardinal against cardinal and bishop against bishop. I think we've only begun to see that. I think stuff is going to come out of the Vatican in the next year or two that is going to put that over the top. So there's certain things that we know for certain. But as to the exact timeline, we don't have certitude. So anytime you get anybody who says, this is going to be, this is when the world is going to end, you just have to ignore them because the evidence, our Lord and Our Lady have only given us enough evidence, but from that evidence, we can't derive enough information or certitude or knowledge about the thing to have certitude about a specific timeline. A perfect example is the guy who started the Jehovah's Witnesses. Judge Rutherford, who started Jehovah's Witnesses, predicted the end of the world 5 different times. Of course, it never happened, which tells you right there, well, okay, his religion is suspect. Okay, aside from the fact that according to his inner circle, he actually just started the religion in order to make money, which it always goes back to the money, it seems. Okay. So anyway, we don't have that certitude about that timeline. So a lot of times people say, what's going to happen next, Father? I'm like, I don't know. I know eventually the Antichrist is going to come. I know there's going to be an era of peace. So we know certain things, but this gets to a very specific moral issue or spiritual issue in people's lives. Our lower faculties, our emotions and our appetites, desire the emotional satisfaction we get out of having clarity about things. The problem is that there are certain things that we simply cannot have clarity about. And so what has to happen is, over the course of time, and this is where studiosity overcomes curiosity, the curiosity has to give way. Where we're seeking knowledge is not proper state in life. We're trying to gain knowledge about this stuff when it's outside our purview, and God didn't actually want us knowing all these things. It's not healthy. It's actually it's going to drive appetitive disorders if people aren't careful, just trying to seek that certitude about certain things. This is why every time you get some guy, sometimes they're priests now, who are saying, Our Lady said to me that this is going to happen next, and this is going to happen next. And people are all like glumming onto this and just following it with bated breath. And you're just like, Our Lord and Our Lady, one of the things that they have shown is that they give us a certain amount of information that's necessary for our spiritual well-being, and that's it. They don't give us detailed information about exactly what's coming next as a general rule. Once in a while they will, but that's only because it's to confirm our understanding of this thing or to let us know this is what's going to happen. So, for example, when she predicted if man doesn't change, and even worse war, which is World War II, is going to break out, right? So she was predicting that. But it's really for our spiritual benefit. If it's not, they don't give us the information. And so because we don't have certitude about that stuff, people have to work on refraining their inclinations to wanting to judge things greater than they are or less than they are because of their emotional appetites. What am I getting at? What it really boils down to is that when you read things like in the news media, or when you read a new study that just came out, or read anything, it's how much evidence do you have, and what certitude does the evidence actually admit? And my judgment should go no farther or no less than the degree of that evidence. I shouldn't think, well, I still think that this is the case, despite the fact that the evidence isn't there. You can say it looks like it's heading this direction, or it could be this, but you have to refrain from trying to having certitude about certain things. And this also means in relationship to our own opinions about matters. If the evidence doesn't admit of certitude, or only admits of a certain degree of certitude, to actually want to conclude more than the evidence admits, is contrary to the virtue of truthfulness. It's contrary to the virtue of temperance, where we get satisfaction and pleasure out of having clarity. It's contrary to fortitude, because part of fortitude is refraining our interior dispositions and realizing, okay, we can only go so far in relationship to this thing, etc. But it's also painful. It's an arduous thing to cut yourself off from wanting to have certitude about these things. Okay, so there has to be a refraining in relationship to this. Those particular elements are going to become particularly important when we talk about detraction in the next conference. But it's something that we have to work on. If there is certitude, if there's evidence, then we follow the evidence. If it's not the evidence, then we don't. Or if the evidence only admits of a certain degree of certitude, then that's it. So, for example, right now I'm actually writing a book on the limits of papal authority over the liturgy. And so there are certain things that we know for certain that he cannot do. For example, even the popes have said the pope cannot act in relationship to the liturgy and a liturgical change. He cannot act contrary to the natural law or divine positive law, period. Okay, so we know that for certain. But then there's certain things that could be from divine tradition or divino-apostolic tradition, but there's not enough evidence to have certitude that that's where it came from. There's reports of it, and there's indications of it. It looks like it, but that's the degree that we have to hold. On the other hand, that means when the Pope acts, he has to take into consideration, well, because I don't know where this thing came from, I better leave it alone so I don't end up messing it up or irritating God in the process. Okay. But the point being is that there's the different degrees of certitude, and a true scientist in precision will try and give assent only to the degree that the evidence will ever allow. And that's really important. Okay. There's a corollary to this. The formulation of the principle of evidence has different ways in which it's formulated. So one of the corollaries is a single piece of evidence, contrary to a theory, renders the theory in part or in whole false. Let me state that again. A single piece of evidence, contrary to a theory, renders the theory in part or in whole false. We know that evolution is either in part or in whole false because there's contrary evidence. And this is a very key thing because it all started. The problem with this all started with statistics when they're doing statistical analysis. So when in statistics, you'd have a situation where you'd have like a normal bell curve if you take a majority of the data. But if you take all the data into consideration, you get these weird anomalies happening on the extremes of the bell curve. And so what they would do is, in order to be able to proceed and figure out, okay, how are we going to look at this thing? How are we going to propose certain things? You know, most people, for example, that fit within the bell curve will accept X, Y, and Z. There's always going to be a certain group of people that aren't going to accept that. And so they would even see this, this statistics also started to creep into psychology, where the person would give you a set of symptomology which would seem to explain one diagnosis, but then there were these outlying pieces of evidence or symptoms that didn't fit that, but this seemed to get the closest to what we would do. And so that what they would do is they would just drop this evidence, that is this data and part of the statistics, in order to get this bell curve so that they could make the conclusion about what they wanted to conclude. Okay. That can have a place in certain circumstances, but only in those things that will admit of that kind of a thing. So like if you're talking about social engineering, well, obviously it's going to be in a bell curve. You're going to have people on the extremes. And that doesn't mean that you basically, that your theory on what you should do, it should basically be based on what most people are going to respond to, because then over the course of time that'll have more of an effect even on the extremes. But it doesn't mean, though, that so you can probably not pay too much attention to those people on the extremes and just go with what it's generally going to do. But that cannot work. That cannot work in relationship to this, where you just ignore certain parts of the data or the evidence in order to continue with your theory. That cannot work in the general empirical sciences, like medicine, physics, etc. It cannot work there because that's not how those things work. So it's a misapplication of that. Okay. So, but a single piece of evidence contrary to a theory renders the theory in part and in whole. You would see this on the mainstream news media. You know, they would say, well, Biden's been to the border. Where's your evidence for that? There's no evidence for that. In fact, the evidence is the contrary to that, right? Or, as I mentioned, it's the... they'd say there's no voter fraud. Well, sorry, but we already know there's voter fraud, because even if it's not on the level that they want to admit, it does occur because they're convicting people of it, and there's all sorts of stuff that we see. You can watch the videos where you see it happening in real time. Okay, so it's not like it's not there. So the fact that they just ignore the stuff that they don't want to so they can stick with the thing is contrary to the principle of evidence. If you keep doing that over the course of time, it's going to cause both the people that listen to you in that behavior, but also you yourself, to lose your contact with reality, because the evidence is the reality. And so eventually, if you keep cutting it off psychologically, eventually you're going to lose contact with it, and you're going to, what that is called mental illness. Okay. Another variant is what is objectively evident is true. Now, this flies in the face of what Biden said. You might have the evidence. You might have evidence, you might have the facts, but we have the truth. Sorry, the evidence is what determines the truth of the situation, and this is something that people have to be willing to conform to. Scientific studies and research being certain things and only doing certain things and actually destroying certain things in order to maintain his little fiefdom. And so this has become a serious problem. Another variant is the thing in the condition of evidence is the measure of the truth of judgments. What does it mean? It means the thing in its circumstances, how the thing is in reality, as I mentioned before, determines the truth of my judgment, both as to that it is that way, but also the degree that it is that way. So, for example, people say all the bishops are evil. Well, actually, that's not true. There are some bishops, I admit a lot of them are, but some of them aren't. And so one of the things about the principle of evidence is you're seeing people going to excess in their judgments about how bad bishops are, or how bad, as far as number, or how bad the clergy are. Another perfect proof of the violation of the principle of evidence is the whole pedophilia scandal in the church. If you read the mainstream news media, they act like every single priest that walks along is a pedophile. But in point and fact, statistically, only 1.25% of priests are pedophiles. The statistical, that's not our statistics. That's actually colleges that have done serious statistical research into finding out exactly what the percentages are. And every single one that's done it has come up in that same gamut, 1.25%. The general population, which is also the same as the number of pedophiles among Protestant pastors, is 2.75. The number of people in professional things like doctors, lawyers, etc., the percentage for that is 8%. The percentage for the people who work in public schools is 10%. But if you look at the mainstream news, so that's the statistical reality. What does the mainstream news media, what does the government do? They completely ignore that they've got this gargantuan pedophilia issue. Let's just ignore the evidence of what's going on in the public school system while people, 80% of women who have gone to public school systems and to college say that they have been sexually abused or harassed at some point. And usually the harassment is molestation. It's 80%. You know, and then we act like this, we think it's okay just to ignore this stuff. Whereas, and then what do? The minute some priest gets caught in something, or even if he just allegedly gets caught and then you find out later that it's not true, they just blow it to the hills. It's because they want to beat up on the church. But this is completely contrary to the principle of evidence. The mainstream news media admits they do not follow the principle of evidence. They openly admit it. In their schools where they teach journalism, in the first class they take, they are taught, you are not here to report the facts, aka evidence. You are here to create a story. Well, there's a name for that. It's called fiction. And this is the problem that we actually have, where they create narratives but based on who's paying their bills, who owns their company, what the government wants, etc., rather than what's the actual facts of the situation. And this is one of the things that it's hard to get through their head. I'm not interested in what you want. I'm not interested in what you want me to think. I'm not interested in how you feel. I'm not interested in any of that. I just want to know what's the reality of the situation. And when you tell them that, they take it personally. They hate that. They don't want to hear it. Another one is... So that's another variant. So the thing in the condition of evidence is the measure of the truth of judgments. Next. The evidence for judgments and proof yields that A, every judgment must be based on evidence. Notice, has nothing to do with your emotions. Doesn't matter how I feel about it. Now, you might have heard me tell this story, but I think this will kind of get to it. So when I was about 18 years old, my dad told me I could go fix this one piece of equipment. So I go out and I fix the thing, and I thought I fixed it. I thought it was fixed, right? Then I go to start the thing, and it won't start. Well, I get really torqued off. And what I learned in that, and then my dad says to me, knock it off and fix it. So there's two morals to that story. The first is, how you feel about the thing, I felt like it was fixed, has no bearing on the fact that it wasn't fixed, right? Second, so my feelings have no bearing on reality whatsoever. This is one of the problems. People are literally making people's emotions the criteria of evidence anymore. And it's like my lay assistant who helps us out. He says, since when did emotions become so important? You know, okay. The second part of it is that it doesn't matter how you feel about things. You have to be willing to follow the truth regardless of the personal cost. The fact that the thing wasn't fixed meant that I had to suck it up, eat my pride, eat the anger that I had, and actually deal with the reality of the thing not being fixed and actually fix it. That's what I learned in that process, and that's what we have to learn in this. So every judgment must be based on evidence, not on how I feel, not what I want, not what I think, not my biases, but on the evidence. And self-evident judgments do not need demonstration. What does that mean? There are certain things that are self-evident, and you don't need to prove them. So, for example, if you say to somebody, I had a friend of mine when we were growing up, and I was talking to him about something. He was just denying everything, and I said, okay, well, let's just see if we can agree on some basic things. Let's just agree that a wrapper is a wrapper. And we're talking like on a piece of candy or something. He wouldn't admit it, which is the most fundamental principle of self-evident principle, that a thing is what it is. Anybody with rational use of their mind hears that and knows, yeah, a thing is what it is, right? Or things cannot not be and be in the same time, there's any same respect. So self-evident principles, so even the principle of evidence, we know this is true. As I've just explained this, I'm sure you're thinking to yourself, yeah, this makes total sense. You know, it's kind of like this, one of the last conferences I gave, someone said, you know, I can't believe you had to give a conference or two conferences on something that everybody knows through common sense. I said, yeah, I know. It's just that what's happening is that people need the affirmation because they're getting chiseled away at by the mainstream news media and the government, okay, on these issues. The principle in all its variants are based upon the principle of sufficient reason. Now, the principle of sufficient reason is that the existence of a thing is accountable either in itself or in another. Now, colloquially, we break that down into you cannot give what you do not have, or you can only give what you have. So what does that mean? It means that the principle of evidence is based on the reality that the thing can only give us, in the relationship to our limitation of our faculties, it's the thing that is the sufficient criteria for the truth, for one, and it can only give, the nature of the thing can only give us, because of the limitation of our faculties, a certain degree of certitude. So it's ultimately based on the principle of sufficient reason. So people who go around trying to assert that things are more certain than the evidence allows are violating the principle of sufficient reason. They're literally pulling a rabbit out of their hat. It was literally, and you saw this, I think it was either Richard Dawkins or Hawkins who said it, but he said the gap between nothing and something was so infinitesimally small that it just jumped out. Well, what's this it? It didn't pre-exist, so it can't jump, right? It's literally on that level a complete violation of the principle of sufficient reason. This is one of the problems that we're actually seeing in the sciences in general, especially mathematics and astrophysics. The people are coming up with theories that have zero contact with reality, that contradict known rational principles, and because they contradict known rational principles, cannot be the basis of any scientific endeavor whatsoever, period. This is a huge issue. This is why it's sad, because you're just watching the dissolution. We are actually in a period of it. We're in a dark age of a sort. You know, everybody poo-poos the dark ages of the middle, you know, that were during the Middle Ages or what have you, or before, and yet they actually had more scientific sense than they do today. Okay. We must not give assent to something unless there is sufficient evidence, and even then only to the degree that it will allow. We should avoid forming opinions about matters that are by nature unclear. You can say, well, I don't know. Ultimately, if we're going to really stay our emotions, when the thing doesn't have clarity, we'd say, well, it could be these, and these things. And if people say, well, what's your opinion on the matter? Well, frankly, I don't have an opinion on the matter. One of the things that drives me more bananas than people will come up and say, Father, what's your take on this? Or what's your opinion on this? I'll tell them, well, I'll tell you what. I'm not going to tell you my opinion. I'll tell you what the church has taught for 2,000 years. How's that? Right? And they're like, oh, okay. You're like, you know, there's an automatic attitude that there is no criteria for assent. Ultimately, objective criteria. It's just everybody's opinions on everything. So this is something that we have to really refrain that. And even if we do formulate opinion, then what we really need to do is make sure that we are completely detached from our judgment in relationship to that opinion. Completely detached. This is we see this among traditionalists all the time. And one of the areas that you're starting to see it more and more is in Sedevacantism. People are jumping into that, and there's not sufficient evidence. There's not sufficient clarity. Certain saints said this is how it's to proceed. Other saints said this is how it's supposed to proceed. When the Holy Father says things are contrary to faith, then there's certain aspects about how you actually judge the interior state, etc. This is an area where someone like myself, who has spent 30 to 40 years researching ecclesiology, studying this stuff, reading the major authors, it's still not clear to me, because I don't think it's that clear in the evidence. That is, that the saints contradict each other. Some of them do. Some of them do this. And so you cannot just pick one saint and say, I like this, because then we're back to the statistical thing again, where you ignore the anomalies and just stick to your theory. It doesn't work that way. So when it comes to the only thing we know for certain is, and even I should say we have some degree of certitude, is that it's the common opinion of theologians that if the Pope commits a formal act of heresy, he loses his office. But we also know that there is no authority above the Pope. So nobody can judge whether the Pope has actually lost his office or not. It's only the subsequent Pope. That's the only thing that we know. And if you look at historically, that's how it played itself out. All the theories of Cajetan and Robert Bellarmine and all these things about how to proceed are just that, theories. And even they propose them as theories, not as absolute fact, even though moderns today are taking it. Why? Because they don't like the emotional pain of this lack of certitude regarding these things. Well, sorry, I can live my Catholic faith to the fullest without having certitude about the status of the Pope. I don't need that, right? All I need to do is know that I have to be in union with the Pope. There's certain things I have to do, etc., in order to live a Catholic faith. Okay. So this has become a big problem even among the traditionalists. The problem of thinking, there's also the problem of people thinking everything is unclear because they don't know the evidence or reality well enough. People just presume anything that has to do with religion is unclear. Well, no, there's some things we know we have certitude. When you do have certitude, this is something that I come across about once a year. Someone will accuse me of being arrogant. Well, first of all, that may be true, but it's completely independent of this criticism. And what they'll always say is, he acts like these things are more certain than they actually are. No, actually, they're more certain than you want to admit that they actually are, right? And we do have certitude about certain things and not others. And so when you have that degree of certitude, and then you talk about them with confidence, knowing this is the reality of the thing, and with clarity, there's certain people who are wed to things being unclear because they're usually immoral lives. They get annoyed with that, and they don't like it. On the other hand, it is arrogant to assert that something is more certain than it is, as we see a large segment of the scientific population. There's just a lack of humility among a large percentage of them. Okay. Any questions? Yeah.
Yes, I have one question. You mentioned that to live a good Catholic life, you need to be in union with the Pope.
Right.
Can you please explain that? Because I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, actually, part of the reason you're not sure is because even the authors aren't exactly sure. Because they just say that you have to, they do boil it down to this, that you have to, on the side of your will to be in union with the man who occupies the see. Just generically.
For his office or for the man?
The office.
The office. Okay.
That's what they generally say. There was some discussion at the First Vatican Council about making the distinction between the man and the office, but they said, no, it's not going to go into the documents. Now, the reason they didn't want to do that is because then it's too easy for people to say, well, I'm in union with the office, but not the man. Well, if the man has the office, then you're technically speaking in union with the man anyway. So, because the office and the man are not distinct. The office of the papacy does not exist except in an individual man.
So, yeah. Father, what that means is as long as everything with regards to truth
That's
to be
right.
in union with him.
That would
So
be correct.
Except nothing that is not contrary to the faith.
That's right. So if I accept all the teachings of the church and I'm trying to live a Catholic life, then de facto you're accepting that particular element. Any other questions? Yeah.
I have family members who are following, I think, the priest you were talking about. He's an exorcist, and he believes in Medjugorje, and he's
Right.
really out there. He's really got a lot of videos. And
Right.
so, very close family member, and she and I were really together, and then we went like this, and she's really become the Novus Medjugorje, which we were so anti, it's just kind of, it's hard to watch.
Right.
When you, I know I pray for her, it's hard to get through to them. Is there something happening with this mass of the Novus Ordo that's affecting these loved ones who are in the Novus Ordo? It just seems like over the years she's really getting into some things that we would reject, and I don't know what's going on.
Yeah,
they're really flocking to
I
this.
think that only in part. I think there's certain aspects of it that are that way. So, for example, the fact that the new mass is said versus populum, it doesn't have to be, but the fact that it's said versus populum, basically you're facing the people, so it gives people a lack of certitude about where's God in all this, right? So even a cardinal said, even though you're facing the people, you should be interiorly facing God. Well, okay, we're already bifurcating ourselves, right? So there's a certain element. The fact that everything is based on emotion, not everything, but a lot of priests base things on emotion in their selection of the liturgical stuff is also problematic. But I would say I think it's more of the modern church culture, in the sense that because the magisterium is failing in its job, people are looking for certitude about spiritual things in any place they can find them. And so I think that's what you're actually seeing. In fact, apparitions are a perfect example. The only time we should give any assent of certitude about an apparition is when the church has judged on it. So people will say, yeah, but you believe in the apparitions of Mary Julie Jeheni. I said, yeah, but only to a degree. I'm only willing to, if the church comes out and says, no, this isn't true, c'est la vie, right? It's not going to affect me. And it doesn't change how I'm going to proceed. It doesn't change my faith. It doesn't affect my faith. But when some of these other ones, like when the bishops have said, no, there's nothing happening here, and people still continue to say, I believe that in Medjugorje, because that's what's happened in Medjugorje, then in that particular case, it's contrary to the evidence, right? And that's actually the church's investigations into apparitions is a perfect example of the principle of evidence. They look let's see exactly what the evidence is, let's do a thorough investigation, let's find out all the information and the facts first. Then, if the facts don't lend themselves to judging one way or another, then we either don't pronounce judgment on it, or we say there's not sufficient evidence to say that it's supernatural. Or if there's evidence contrary to it, then you say, well, then it's not supernatural, right? Okay. And then there's Medjugorje, where the church has passed judgment on it. There is the ones where that it's in the negative, and then the church has passed stuff that's in the positive, like Fatima, for example, is pretty clear. But the church follows that principle very closely, not just about the facts, but also to what degree of certitude can we have in relationship to those things. And that's a lesson that people need to take. So in those particular cases, I think it goes back to people's emotions affect their judgment, and so they think that the thing is greater than it is, or it's more true than it actually is, etc. I think that's the emotions are affecting their judgment. But it's also a sign that the church just isn't doing its job in teaching people, because if people were catechized well and had good devotional lives, and the church is promoting the right things, etc., you'd see a lot less of that, I think.
I think what you just said is that the Mass is not enough for a lot of people because they aren't being catechized well.
That's right. Yeah, I think so. One more question.
Okay, I'm going off here. There's a famous, I don't know how to frame this question. There's a famous entrepreneur that he's puzzling me with the AI morality.
Yeah.
You know, is there evidence there's going to be a moral form of artificial intelligence?
Yes, if they program the machine to do it. If they don't, it doesn't mean. In fact, what their experiment shows, if they leave it without any moral coding, that they just had a machine just recently basically conclude that it should kill all human beings.
Right.
Because
and he's
because
warning about it.
yeah, he is. So they can program the machine to do in its algorithms to take into consideration those things in its processes, but a lot of times they're not. In fact, a lot of times they're left out precisely because they want certain outcomes.
He did say that the reality might be a neural link is going to be the only thing that's going to control the immorality of it.
No, I don't think so. I think that you can actually you can work it into the coding. In other words, do you know how AI actually works?
It's I listened to him.
Yeah. So basically, how it makes selections and how it goes, like it'll first try like 5 different things, and then it checks to see if they're positive. If not, then it goes back, and so it goes. It gets narrowed down, right? So it goes through this process. How it makes the if-then statements in that process, the algorithms, you can put moral stuff into that, so that if something comes up that's clearly immoral, it's considered as a non-viable result to the if-then statement.
Yeah, so you're going back to the money and who wants to put what into it.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Okay. Well, if you'll kneel, I'll give you a